It was a warm Saturday morning, and I was feeling grateful. My wife, Lila, and I had been married for 6 years. Our life was simple yet fulfilling. We had recently purchased a charming 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood, and it finally felt like our lives were settling into a rhythm. I had a stable job as an IT consultant, and Lila was pursuing her passion for yoga and wellness. My younger brothers, Ethan and Caleb, were visiting for the weekend. Both of them were trained masseurs and had recently started a mobile massage business together. Their visits always brought life to our otherwise serene home. They joked, cooked, and shared wild stories about their clients, which often left us in stitches. That Saturday, I decided to go fishing with a friend, leaving Lila at home. Ethan and Caleb had offered to treat her to a massage session as a gesture of gratitude for letting them stay over. I thought it was a sweet idea, considering how much stress she had been dealing with at her yoga studio. As I packed my gear, Lila came downstairs in her leggings and a loose tank top. She looked radiant, her hair tied up in a messy bun. "Don't catch too many fish," she teased, pecking me on the cheek. "Don't worry. I'll probably just enjoy the peace," I replied. "The boys will take good care of you. They've been hyping up their massage techniques all morning." "I hope they're as good as they claim," she said with a chuckle. "Let me know if they're not," I joked, winking as I grabbed my keys. As I left, I had no inkling of what was to come. My mind was on the calm waters of the lake and the idea of a quiet day out. Little did I know, the day would plant the seeds of betrayal in a way I could never imagine. After I left, the house began to settle into its usual calm. Lila poured herself a glass of water and glanced at her reflection in the kitchen window. The morning sun gave her skin a golden glow, and a part of her felt giddy at the thought of having Ethan and Caleb pamper her with a massage. It was a harmless indulgence, she told herself. Upstairs, Ethan and Caleb were preparing their setup in the spare room. The boys had brought their equipment, portable massage tables, oils, and soft, calming music. Both of them were professionals and took their work seriously, but they couldn't help but exchange grins as they joked about who would give the better massage. "All right," Caleb said. "Let's see if the golden hands of Ethan can outshine me today." "Golden hands? That's rich coming from the guy who dropped oil on a client's carpet last week." Ethan shot back with a smirk. They laughed, the camaraderie evident. However, as they laid out the oils and towels, there was an unspoken air of tension. Neither of them acknowledged it, but there was something about being in their brother's home that felt different. Lila knocked lightly on the door before stepping in. She looked slightly hesitant, but smiled warmly. "Okay, boys, I'm ready for the famous treatment. Don't disappoint me." "Never," Ethan said, his voice steady. "You're in good hands." She lay on the table, and Caleb started with her shoulders, his hands firm yet gentle. The soft strains of instrumental music filled the room, and Lila began to relax. Ethan worked on her lower back, carefully avoiding Caleb's area of focus to ensure a smooth and professional flow. "This is amazing," Lila murmured. "I could get used to this." The brothers chuckled, their tone light. "Well, we might have to start charging you," Caleb teased. For the moment, everything felt normal. But as the session progressed, a subtle shift occurred. Ethan's hands lingered a moment too long on her waist, and Caleb's eyes flickered toward her face more often than necessary. Lila was too relaxed to notice the growing tension between the brothers. The professional facade began to crack, just slightly. What started as a routine massage now carried an undertone neither of them could define or deny. The soothing music continued to play, the melody blending seamlessly with the rhythmic sound of their hands working over Lila's body. Ethan moved to her shoulders while Caleb shifted to her legs, the transition almost imperceptible. "This is like heaven," Lila murmured, her voice dreamy. Ethan smirked. "See? We told you we were good at this." Caleb chuckled. "And we're just getting started." The atmosphere grew heavier, though neither Lila nor the brothers acknowledged it aloud. Caleb's hands pressed into her calves with practiced precision, his touch firm yet deliberate. Ethan's fingers grazed the base of her neck, applying pressure in just the right spots. As the session progressed, Caleb's hands moved higher on her thighs, kneading with a focus that bordered on lingering. Lila's breath hitched for a moment, a sound so faint that it could have been dismissed. But Ethan noticed. His eyes briefly locked with Caleb's, a silent exchange that neither was willing to address. Lila, seemingly unaware of the unspoken tension, sighed deeply. You two are really incredible. I don't think I've ever been this relaxed. We aim to please, Caleb replied, his voice smooth. Ethan moved his hands lower, brushing against the curve of her back. Lila tensed slightly, just enough for both brothers to feel it. She shifted on the table, her face still hidden in the headrest. Too much pressure? Ethan asked, his tone soft. No, it's fine, she replied quickly, though her voice carried a subtle edge of uncertainty. Caleb's hands paused briefly, then continued their work, slower this time. Ethan mirrored his movements, but an invisible line had already been crossed. The air in the room felt thicker, charged with an unspoken energy none of them could ignore. Lila shifted again, her body betraying her growing awareness of the dynamics at play. Maybe we should take a break, she suggested, her voice tinged with nervous laughter. Caleb stepped back immediately, wiping his hands on a towel. Of course. We can pause anytime. Ethan lingered a moment longer, his hands hovering near her lower back before he finally withdrew. Good idea, he said, though his voice sounded strained. As Lila sat up, adjusting her tank top and smoothing her hair, she avoided looking directly at either of them. That was really something, she said, her smile forced. Caleb nodded, his expression unreadable. Glad you enjoyed it. Ethan's eyes lingered on her a moment longer than necessary before he turned away, busying himself with the oils. The session was over, but the unspoken tension was far from resolved. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, or so it seemed. Lila busied herself with household chores, but her mind lingered on the massage session. The brothers went out for a walk, claiming they needed some fresh air, though neither seemed in a hurry to return. By the time evening rolled around, the three of them were seated in the living room, sharing a bottle of wine. The conversation was casual, filled with laughter and light-hearted stories. But beneath the surface, the tension from earlier lingered, palpable in every shared glance and lingering pause. Ethan poured another round of wine, his movements uncharacteristically slow. So, Lila, he said, his tone light, what's it like being married to our stick-in-the-mud brother? Lila laughed, though her smile faltered slightly. Oh, he's not that bad. He keeps things interesting in his own way. Interesting? Caleb teased. That's a new one. The wine flowed, and with it, the barriers began to erode. Lila felt her shoulders relax, the warmth of the alcohol loosening the knot of tension that had settled there since the massage. I mean it, she said, leaning back in her chair. Your brother's a good man. Reliable, thoughtful, but, you know, a bit predictable sometimes. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Predictable? That doesn't sound very exciting. It's not about excitement, Lila countered, her tone defensive. It's about stability. He's always there when I need him. Caleb smirked. But do you ever miss the thrill of unpredictability? The kind of excitement that shakes things up? The question hung in the air, heavier than the casual banter they'd been sharing moments ago. Lila hesitated, her gaze flickering between the two brothers. She felt a flush creep up her neck, though she wasn't sure if it was from the wine or the weight of Caleb's words. I think we all need a little excitement now and then, Ethan said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. Lila glanced at him, her heartbeat quickening. Are you two always this full of yourselves? She asked, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. Always, Caleb said with a grin, though his eyes didn't leave hers. The wine glasses emptied, and the room grew quieter, the laughter tapering off into thoughtful silence. Eventually, Caleb stood, stretching lazily. I'm heading to bed, he said, though his gaze lingered on Lila for a fraction of a second too long. Yeah, me too, Ethan added, rising from his seat. Lila nodded, her smile tight. Good night, guys. As the brothers disappeared up the stairs, Lila remained in her chair, staring at the empty wine glass in her hand. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. The morning sun filtered through the curtains as Lila stirred in bed, the events of the previous day flickering through her mind. She felt a strange mixture of unease and anticipation, though she couldn't quite place why. Downstairs, the smell of freshly brewed coffee greeted her as she entered the kitchen. Caleb and Ethan were already there, casually discussing a recent client while sipping their mugs. "Morning, sleepyhead," Ethan greeted her with a grin. "Morning," she replied, forcing a smile. "Hope you slept well after yesterday's session," Caleb added, his tone carrying a hint of something unspoken. Lila hesitated before pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Yeah, I did. Thanks for that, by the way. You guys really know your stuff. Well, if you ever want to follow up, you know where to find us," Caleb said, leaning back against the counter. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, next time, we could try a different technique. Something a little more immersive." The comment caught Lila off guard. She glanced at him, searching his face for any sign of teasing, but his expression was calm, almost too calm. "Immersive?" she asked, her voice carrying a nervous edge. Ethan smirked. "Don't worry, nothing too intense. Just a few advanced techniques we don't usually offer." Caleb chimed in, his voice smooth. "It's all about relaxation and connection. You know, creating a space where you can truly let go." Lila sipped her coffee, trying to mask the heat rising in her cheeks. "Sounds interesting," she said cautiously. The brothers exchanged a glance, their silent communication unnerving. "Think about it," Ethan said, his voice light. "We're here all weekend." Lila nodded, her thoughts racing. She couldn't ignore the pull of curiosity, or the danger it implied. As the day unfolded, she found herself lingering in their presence more than usual. Their jokes seemed funnier, their smiles warmer, and their presence magnetic. The boundaries that once felt so clear now seemed blurred, her internal alarms drowned out by an intoxicating mix of flattery and intrigue. By the time evening arrived, Lila found herself standing outside the spare room where the massage had taken place. She knocked lightly, her hand trembling. "Come in," Caleb's voice called out. Pushing the door open, she found both brothers inside, sitting casually on the massage tables they had set up. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "about what you said earlier. About letting go." Ethan smiled, his eyes gleaming. "We were hoping you'd say that." Lila stepped into the room, her nerves frayed but her curiosity overpowering her better judgment. The dim lighting and soft scent of essential oils created an atmosphere that felt both calming and charged with unspoken tension. Ethan stood and approached her with a reassuring smile. "We'll make sure you feel completely at ease," he said softly, his voice soothing. Caleb stayed seated, his eyes following her movements with a calm intensity. "This is about you, Lila," he added. "We want you to feel free." Lila hesitated for a moment before taking a seat on the edge of the massage table. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to walk away, but her body betrayed her, staying still as Ethan gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Let's start simple," he said, his touch light but deliberate. She nodded, her throat dry. Caleb moved closer, standing at her other side. His hand brushed her arm as he reached for a bottle of oil, the contact sending a ripple of sensation through her. "You trust us, don't you?" Caleb asked, his voice low. I think so," she replied, her voice barely audible. The session began as it had the day before, with the brothers working in tandem to ease her tension. Ethan focused on her shoulders and neck while Caleb massaged her legs, their movements synchronized and deliberate. But this time, the atmosphere was different. The touches lingered, their hands exploring areas they hadn't ventured to before. Lila's breath quickened, and she felt a heat rising within her that she couldn't ignore. "Is this okay?" Ethan asked, his voice soft but carrying a weight of meaning. Lila hesitated before nodding. "Yes," she whispered. The brothers exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between them. Caleb's hands moved higher, his fingers brushing the edge of her shorts. Ethan's touch grew firmer, his fingers grazing the base of her neck in a way that made her shiver. Lila closed her eyes, surrendering to the sensations that overwhelmed her. The boundaries she had once clung to crumbled under the weight of her desire, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. "Just let go," Caleb murmured, his voice like a hypnotic chant. As the minutes passed, the line between professionalism and intimacy disappeared entirely. The room became a cocoon of whispered breaths and stolen touches, a space where consequences ceased to exist. But deep down, a small voice in Lila's mind warned her of the storm she was inviting into her life. A storm that was fast approaching, waiting to shatter everything she held dear. The following morning, Lila woke up feeling disoriented, the events of the previous night flashing in fragments through her mind. She sat up in bed, pulling the blanket around her, and stared out the window at the golden rays of sunlight filtering through the trees. She told herself it had been a moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment fueled by curiosity and the strange magnetism of her husband's brothers. But the memory of their touches lingered, both thrilling and deeply unsettling. Downstairs, the house was quiet. Lila tiptoed to the kitchen and found Ethan sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, scrolling through his phone. He looked up as she entered, his lips curling into a slow smile. "Morning," he said, his tone casual, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper. "Morning," Lila replied, her voice tentative. She poured herself a cup of coffee, her hands trembling slightly. Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You okay? You seem off." "I'm fine," she lied, avoiding his gaze. Before he could respond, Caleb entered the room, his presence filling the space. "Morning, you too," he said brightly, though his grin was tinged with a knowing look that made Lila's stomach twist. The three of them fell into an uneasy silence, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on them. Lila sipped her coffee, willing herself to act normal, but the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. Eventually, Caleb broke the silence. "So, what's the plan for today?" he asked, his tone deliberately light. "I was thinking of going for a walk," Lila said quickly, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere. "Sounds nice," Ethan said, his gaze lingering on her. "Want some company?" "No," she said, perhaps a bit too forcefully. I think I need some time to myself." Caleb smirked, exchanging a glance with Ethan. "Of course. Take all the time you need." Lila nodded, finishing her coffee in a single gulp before retreating upstairs to change. As she pulled on her sneakers, her mind raced. She couldn't stay in the house with them, not today. She needed space to think, to figure out how she had let things spiral so far out of control. But even as she stepped out into the crisp morning air, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just running from them. She was running from herself. Lila spent the morning wandering through the nearby park, her thoughts a tangled web of guilt, desire, and confusion. The cool breeze and the rustling leaves offered some clarity, but the weight of her choices lingered. "How did I let this happen?" she muttered under her breath, her voice barely audible over the chirping of birds. She thought of her husband, picturing his easy smile and the way he always tried to make her laugh. The memory of his kindness made her chest ache with guilt. What would he think if he knew? How could she ever explain what she had done, what she had allowed to happen? By the time she returned home, the sun was high in the sky, and the house seemed eerily quiet. She opened the door cautiously, half expecting to find Ethan or Caleb waiting for her. Instead, the living room was empty, save for a half-finished puzzle on the coffee table. As she stepped inside, she heard faint voices coming from upstairs. Curiosity, or perhaps dread, compelled her to follow the sound. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step amplifying the murmur of conversation. At the top, she paused outside the spare room. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear Ethan and Caleb speaking in hushed tones. "I told you it was risky," Caleb said, his voice low but firm. "And I told you she wanted it," Ethan shot back. "She didn't stop us, did she?" "That's not the point," Caleb replied. "This is dangerous, Ethan. If he finds out—" Lila's stomach dropped. She leaned closer, straining to hear more. "Relax," Ethan said dismissively. "He's not going to find out. As long as we keep things under control, everything will be fine." Lila couldn't breathe. The brothers were discussing her like a secret, a shared indiscretion they were trying to manage. Suddenly, the door creaked as she shifted her weight, and both voices stopped abruptly. Lila, Ethan called out, his tone wary. She pushed the door open, her heart pounding. The brothers were standing near the massage tables, their expressions a mix of surprise and guilt. "We need to talk," Lila said, her voice trembling. Caleb crossed his arms, leaning casually against the table. "About what?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "About last night," she said, her words barely more than a whisper. This can't happen again." Ethan took a step toward her, his expression softening. "Lila, we're all adults here. No one's forcing you into anything." "That's not the point," she snapped, her voice breaking. "This isn't right. It's not who I am." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure about that?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, daring her to confront the truth she was trying so desperately to deny. The tension in the spare room was suffocating. Lila stood frozen near the doorway, her heart pounding as Ethan and Caleb stared her down. Their confidence, their casual demeanor, it infuriated her. "I mean it," she said, her voice steadier now. "Whatever this is, it ends here. I won't let it go any further." Ethan stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Lila, you act like you didn't enjoy it. We all did." His words struck her like a blow, forcing her to confront the feelings she had been trying to suppress. She had enjoyed it too much, and that realization twisted her stomach with shame. "That doesn't make it right," she said, her voice barely audible. Caleb shook his head, a cynical smile playing on his lips. "You can tell yourself whatever you need to, but we both know the truth." Lila glared at him, anger flaring in her chest. "The truth? The truth is I love my husband, and I made a mistake, a terrible mistake." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Caleb, however, chuckled softly. "Love? Is that what you call it? Because last night didn't look like love to me." "Enough," Lila snapped, her voice trembling with emotion. "You don't get to judge me. You don't get to make this worse than it already is." Caleb shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Whatever you say, Lila." She turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. Her hands shook as she leaned against the wall in the hallway, trying to steady her breathing. She couldn't stay here, not with them. Not after everything that had happened. Grabbing her phone, she texted her husband. "Hey, when are you coming home?" The reply came almost immediately. Him, "Just finishing up. Should be back in an hour." "Everything okay?" Her fingers hovered over the screen as she debated what to say. Finally, she typed, "Everything's fine. Just miss you." But everything wasn't fine. The guilt, the shame, the fear. It was all bubbling inside her, threatening to spill over. And she knew that no matter how much she tried to suppress it, the truth would eventually come to light. Lila spent the next hour pacing the living room, her nerves frayed as she waited for her husband to return. The walls of the house, once her sanctuary, now felt like they were closing in on her. When she finally heard the sound of his car pulling into the driveway, her stomach twisted. She plastered on a smile and tried to look composed as the front door opened. "Hey, I'm home," he called out cheerfully, his fishing gear slung over his shoulder. "Welcome back," she said, meeting him at the door. She forced herself to hug him, her heart aching with guilt as his arms wrapped around her. "You okay?" he asked, pulling back to study her face. "You seem tense." "I'm fine," she lied. "Just a long day." He smiled, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. "Well, let's relax tonight. Maybe order some takeout and watch a movie." "That sounds perfect," she said, her voice wavering. They settled into the evening routine, but Lila couldn't shake the feeling that the house was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. As the hours ticked by, her husband noticed her fidgeting and asked her several times if something was wrong. Each time, she brushed it off, trying to keep the cracks in her composure from showing. It was only when she stepped away to grab her phone from the kitchen that the dam finally broke. She found Caleb leaning against the counter, a knowing smirk on his face. "You haven't told him yet," he said, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the living room. Lila glared at him. "Stay out of this, Caleb." "Out of this?" he scoffed. I think I'm already pretty involved, don't you? Before she could respond, her husband's voice called out from the other room. Everything okay in there? Lila froze, panic flashing across her face. Caleb, however, didn't miss a beat. Why don't we tell him the truth, Lila? He said, his voice suddenly louder. What are you talking about? Her husband asked, appearing in the doorway. His brow furrowed as he looked between them. What truth? Lila's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing for an excuse. But Caleb stepped forward, his smirk now replaced with a serious expression. You should ask your wife, he said simply. Her husband's gaze snapped to her, confusion and concern etched into his features. Lila, what's going on? Tears welled in her eyes as she realized there was no way out. The truth had been set in motion, and there was no stopping it now. The weight of Caleb's words hung in the air, suffocating and unrelenting. Lila's husband looked at her, his confusion quickly giving way to suspicion. Lila, he said, his voice steady but edged with unease. What's he talking about? She opened her mouth to speak, but found no words. Her hands trembled as she clutched the counter behind her for support, the ground beneath her seeming to tilt. It's nothing, she stammered weakly. Caleb's just being dramatic. Caleb snorted, crossing his arms. Dramatic? Really? That's how you're going to play this? Ethan appeared in the doorway, his face tight with concern. Caleb, stop, he said sharply. But the damage was already done. Lila's husband turned to Caleb, his eyes narrowing. What's going on here? Someone better start talking, and it better be the truth. Caleb met his gaze, his expression cold. You want the truth? Fine. Your wife hasn't exactly been faithful while you've been out playing Fisherman of the Year. The room seemed to freeze. Lila's husband stared at Caleb, his face a mixture of disbelief and fury. What the hell are you saying? He demanded. Lila stepped forward, her voice shaking. It's not what you think. Then tell me what it is, he yelled, his voice cracking with emotion. The silence that followed was deafening. Lila felt her throat tighten as tears spilled down her cheeks. She couldn't bring herself to say it, to confirm the truth that would destroy everything they had built together. I trusted you, he said, his voice breaking. He turned to Caleb and Ethan, his fists clenched. And you too, my own brothers? Ethan stepped forward, his hands raised defensively. Look, it wasn't planned. It just happened. It just happened, her husband repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. He turned to Lila, his eyes now filled with hurt and betrayal. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Did you think this would just go away? I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sorry doesn't cut it, he said, his voice cold. He turned and stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the front door behind him. The silence that followed was unbearable. Lila collapsed into a chair, her body trembling as sobs racked her frame. Nice work, Caleb, Ethan said bitterly, glaring at his brother. What? It was going to come out eventually, Caleb shot back, his tone unapologetic. Lila barely registered their argument. All she could think about was the look in her husband's eyes, the pain, the betrayal. She had shattered his trust, and now she had no idea if she could ever piece it back together. Lila spent the rest of the evening alone in the house, the silence oppressive and suffused with guilt. Caleb and Ethan had retreated to their guest room, leaving her to wrestle with her thoughts. Every minute that passed without her husband's return felt like a dagger to her heart. She had tried calling him multiple times, but her calls went straight to voicemail. The realization that he might not come back tonight, or ever, gnawed at her. Meanwhile, her husband sat in his car in a deserted parking lot, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind was a storm of rage, betrayal, and despair. He had trusted his wife, loved her, and had never imagined that the two people he shared blood with would betray him in the most intimate way. He wasn't the type to lash out blindly, though. Years of careful planning in his professional life had conditioned him to think before acting. And now, a plan began to form. A way to reclaim control and ensure that neither Lila nor his brothers would walk away unscathed. By the time he returned home, the early hours of the morning had arrived. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the kitchen light. Lila had fallen asleep on the couch, her face streaked with dried tears. He stood over her for a moment, the sight of her peaceful, vulnerable state stirring something bitter within him. This woman, who he had thought was his partner in life, had chosen to shatter the foundation of their relationship. He didn't wake her. Instead, he went upstairs to their bedroom and began packing a bag. He needed space to think, away from her, away from his brothers. But before he left, he pulled out his laptop and began typing. The email he composed was methodical, addressed to a private investigator he had worked with briefly on a previous business matter. If there was one thing he knew, it was that secrets had consequences. He wasn't just going to walk away from this betrayal. He was going to expose it. When he finished, he glanced back at the bed they had once shared, now feeling as foreign as a stranger's room. Then, with a heavy heart, he slipped out of the house without saying a word. The days that followed were a haze for Lila. Her husband hadn't returned home, and she had no idea where he was or if he would ever come back. Her calls and texts went unanswered, leaving her trapped in a limbo of guilt and fear. Ethan and Caleb had stayed quiet, their usual banter replaced by an uneasy truce of silence. They avoided her as much as possible, retreating to their guest room or leaving the house altogether for long stretches of time. But while the house remained steeped in tension, her husband was far from idle. He had rented a small apartment in the city under the guise of needing time alone to process the betrayal. In reality, he was meeting with the private investigator, meticulously laying out a plan to dismantle the lies and deceit that had poisoned his life. "I need evidence," he told the investigator, a man named Greg, during their first meeting. "Concrete proof of everything. I want it all documented." Greg nodded, taking notes as he listened. "Do you have access to any communication between them? Texts, emails, anything like that?" "Not yet," her husband admitted, "but I know they've been reckless. If I get access to her phone, would that help?" "Absolutely," Greg said. "The more direct evidence we have, the stronger your case will be, legally and personally." For the next few days, her husband worked in silence, crafting a web to entangle Lila and his brothers. He returned to the house briefly when he knew she wouldn't be home, using the opportunity to install discrete cameras in the common areas and sync her phone's data to his laptop. It didn't take long for him to find the proof he needed. The texts between Lila, Ethan, and Caleb were damning. Flirty exchanges, suggestive comments, and even mentions of their clandestine moments together. As he scrolled through the messages, his initial fury gave way to cold determination. He wasn't just going to end his marriage. He was going to ensure that his brothers and Lila felt the full weight of their betrayal. He began forwarding key pieces of evidence to Greg, compiling a file that painted a clear picture of what had happened. But he wasn't content to stop there. In his mind, revenge wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about taking control of the narrative and ensuring that none of them could easily recover from what they had done. A week later, Lila received a text from her husband, the first since he had stormed out of the house. "Be home at 7 p.m. We need to talk." Her stomach churned as she read the message. The anticipation was unbearable. What would he say? Was there a chance for forgiveness? She spent the day nervously cleaning the house, trying to make everything look perfect, as though tidiness could somehow erase the chaos she had caused. Ethan and Caleb noticed her unease but said nothing, their guilt keeping them confined to their guest room. At precisely 7 p.m., the front door opened, and her husband stepped inside. He looked different, colder, more composed, as though the week apart had forged a shield of resolve around him. "Thanks for being here," he said, his tone clipped. Ethan and Caleb emerged from their room, their faces wary. "What's this about?" Ethan asked cautiously. "I thought it was time we all had a chat," her husband said, setting his laptop on the kitchen table. "About what's been going on under my roof." Lila's heart sank. She exchanged a panicked glance with the brothers, who shifted uncomfortably. "I've been doing some digging," he continued, opening a folder on his laptop. "Turns out, when you're married to someone, you trust them. And when that trust is broken, it's amazing how much you can uncover with a little effort." He turned the laptop around, revealing a series of screenshots, texts between Lila and the brothers, timestamps from their shared moments, and even video footage from the cameras he had secretly installed. Lila's hand flew to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. Ethan and Caleb stood frozen, their faces pale. "This is insane," Caleb said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Her husband shot back, his voice icy. "Because to me, it looks pretty clear." Lila tried to speak, her voice trembling. "Please, let me explain." "Explain what?" he interrupted. "That you betrayed me with my own brothers? That you let them touch you in ways that no one else should? There's nothing to explain, Lila. The evidence speaks for itself." Ethan stepped forward, his hands raised. "Look, we're all at fault here." Her husband's sharp laugh cut him off. "You think this is about blame? This is about consequences. For all of you." He reached into his bag and pulled out a thick envelope, tossing it onto the table. "Divorce papers," he said, addressing Lila. "You'll sign them tonight, or I'll make sure everyone in our social circle sees this." Lila's breath caught, her tears falling freely now. "Please don't do this," she whispered. "Oh, I'm not done," he said, his gaze shifting to Ethan and Caleb. "You two are finished in this family. I've already told Mom and Dad everything, and trust me, they're disgusted." The brothers exchanged panicked glances. "You don't have to involve them," Caleb said, his voice faltering. "Yes, I do," her husband said coldly. "Because you didn't just betray me. You betrayed our family." He stepped back, his expression hard. "I hope it was worth it, because from this moment on, none of you are part of my life." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving the three of them to grapple with the ruins of their choices.